Clive and Elsa, two beloved fan favourites of the Howling Vice Guild. These two characters received a short story titled Return Cursed Guns, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 4, a book that released in Japan in June 2002. You all know the gist of their story. Clive and Elsa grew up together in the Howling Vice Guild along with their friend Kelly. Elsa is a former member who's on the run after killing Kelly and stealing the guns Stern and Mond, while Clive, a top-class gunner, has been sent to hunt her down. That is of course an oversimplification of their story, and there's a lot more depth to it, which is covered in this short story. This short story is a little different than the others though. While all of the other characters' short stories focused entirely on telling original stories from the characters' past, or by filling in a gap in their timeline between their appearances in the games, Clive and Elsa's short story is a blend of being a partial retelling of their storyline from Suikoden 2, with flashbacks to their past covering their time together in the Howling Vice Guild. Do keep in mind that as this is a partial retelling of their Suikoden 2 quest, some scenes and events play out slightly differently than they did in the game. Chapter 1. The story begins near the end of the Dunan Unification War as Elsa is walking through the streets of Radit. As with every town she passed through in this area, the people gazed in admiration at her platinum blonde hair, which was a rarity in these parts. However, everyone was dismayed when they saw the large scar on her face that ran from cheek to cheek across the bridge of her nose. Some looked away and others looked on in curiosity as they wondered how she got her scar. The people's curiosity soon turned to her unusual weapons, which she was now holding in her hands and pointing at a man in a grey cloak. Elsa gazed at Clive, who fell to one knee gripping his shoulder to stem the flow of blood. Clive muttered why, but his question wasn't directed at Elsa. He was looking at his own gun, which had dropped to his feet. As Clive clenched his weapon, Elsa remembered the touch of his fingertips and the warmth of his hands, but her feelings of sentimentality were soon broken when a boy could be heard crying out Clive's name. Clive shouted at Ryu to stay back, but Ryu jumped out from among the crowd of spectators and tried to break Clive free from Elsa's line of fire. Elsa reflexively pointed her gun, and Clive tried to push Ryu behind him to protect him. Elsa had no intention of shooting Ryu and looked for a way to escape as she took a step back, shaking her head. For a moment, Clive and Elsa's gazes collided. Elsa noted how Clive's golden hair and pale skin had tanned during his journey, and how much bigger his muscles had become. But what hadn't changed were his eyes that were always filled with anger. 4 years had passed since they last saw each other. She wondered if those years had been long or short for Clive. Elsa looked at Ryu and said, "See you later, handsome," as she turned and made her escape through the crowd. Clive cried out Elsa's name as she stole a horse by the tavern. As Elsa was riding away, she could hear Clive scream out that he was going to kill her and take back what he believes in. Elsa muttered a question to Clive, asking him if he has anything else he believes in other than the weight of a gun, a question that Clive couldn't hear. After riding out of the town, Elsa looked back. Even though she intentionally avoided shooting Clive in any vital points, she knew it would take some time for him to recover. Riding away, she remembered Clive's words to her, "I will kill you. I will take back what I believe in." She knew that Clive wouldn't have hesitated to kill her, as that's how the children at the tower are raised by the guild. The tower is the name of the Howling Vice Guild's headquarters. From a young age, the children are raised to cut off all emotion during battle, turned into nothing more than an obedient tool to kill your opponent with a single blow. The image of Clive's gun Storm falling from his hands and hitting the floor flashed through Elsa's mind. It's believed that a spirit dwells within Storm, that the gun has a will of its own and that it chooses its owner, which is why the gun didn't fire during Clive and Elsa's last encounter. Elsa then once again begins thinking back on the warmth of Clive's hands and the innocent sincerity he once had as Chapter 1 comes to an end. Chapter 2 begins with Clive waking up as he felt a hand wipe the sweat from his forehead with a damp cloth. Clive asked where he was, and Dr. Huan replied that he's back at their castle in North Window. Huan showed Clive the bullets he pulled from his shoulder and leg, informing him that they barely missed his vital points and how lucky he was that Ryu was there to save him. Even though the bullets were removed, Clive's body burned where Huan said he had been shot. Clive muttered to himself, calling Elsa an idiot for missing and wondering how a night-class gunner like herself could miss. Huan told Clive to stay in bed and get some rest, but Clive ignored his advice and immediately got up, stating that the longer he waits, the more the trail goes cold. As Clive stood up and grabbed the barrel of his gun Storm, he felt a sharp pain shooting through his wound on his left shoulder. Huan again advised Clive to rest and let his wounds heal, but Clive again refused. He thanked Huan for tending to his wounds, but told him not to worry. Clive began thinking about Elsa, how he had finally tracked her down, only to once again have her slip through his grasp. While he was stuck here in the castle, Elsa was getting further and further away. His whole world had been torn apart, and the years had been heavy for Clive since the death of his brother Kelly and the betrayal of Elsa. So just a little note, Kelly isn't actually Clive's brother, but he was like an older brother to him because they grew up together. As Clive put on his leather gloves, which had stiffened from his blood, he closed his eyes tightly to suppress his anger. Elsa had shot him just as easily as she'd shot Kelly. The image of Elsa was burned into Clive's mind. Her blonde hair, her slender and tall physique, her blue eyes, she looked exactly the same as Clive remembered. Clive bit his lip and pushed the infirmary door open. Ryu had been standing outside the room waiting, and his expression brightened up when he saw that Clive was okay. But before he could say a word to Clive walked past him in silence, and with each step he took, he felt pain piercing through the wound in his leg. Much to Clive's irritation, Ryu followed him as he made his way through the castle. Clive could see the smiles and hear the laughter of the residents of the castle, but to him that was nothing more than a fleeting illusion of peace between battles, and he didn't trust anyone who was huddled together having a good time, as even deep, long-held bonds could be easily broken from betrayal. Clive's steps were becoming heavy in his irritation, and he stopped to rest against a wall. He held back a wave of pain as his anger, which was akin to fear, welled up at the lack of strength in his hands to hold Storm. He heard Ryu's voice coming from behind him. Ryu told Clive that he couldn't leave him as he was bleeding so badly he thought his wounds were life-threatening, so he brought him back to the castle for help. Ryu continued talking, but Clive didn't respond. Ryu kept looking down at his hands as he spoke, and Clive guessed that Ryu wasn't very good at conversing with people. There was no sign of the dignified leader of the New Alliance army standing before him, only that of a boy. Ryu finally got Clive's attention when he said, "And that's why I didn't chase her." Clive responded, "Huh?" And Ryu, stumbling and searching for words, replied that, "You said she was a sinner, but you seem like siblings." Clive fell silent again as childhood memories of him playing with Elsa and Kelly came flooding back, but he soon closed his eyes and shook off the memory. Clive then told Ryu that Elsa killed a member of the Howling Vice Guild and stole a pair of guns before running away, and according to Harmonian law, both crimes are punishable by death. He continued by telling Ryu that the person she killed was like a brother to him, that she's his brother's killer. Ryu told Clive, "But you didn't shoot," and Clive angrily responded, shouting that Ryu was wrong. Aware of his tone, Clive then looked down at Storm and explained that no matter how many times he squeezed the trigger, Storm refused to fire. Storm was said to be the only gun in the world in which a spirit resided within. Those who Storm allows to wield it are eligible for consideration for the rank of Master within the guild. Storm had never gone against Clive's will on the battlefield or while he was at the guild, but it refused to fire at Elsa. For the first time, Storm had refused Clive's will, which left him feeling confused and angry. Ryu told Clive that maybe Storm refused to fire because he doesn't really want to kill her. Clive responded by saying that he was much younger than Ryu is now when he shot his first person, and since then he has never, not once hesitated, no matter who it was. He then declared to Ryu that he will kill Elsa as Chapter 2 comes to an end. Chapter 3 begins with Elsa arriving in Muse City. It was her first time back in Muse since the barbarism of the Highland Royal Army, and the stench of death still filled the air. Elsa spotted a large earth-coloured circle in the middle of a street leading to the city centre. The Highland Army had dug a giant hole in the street to throw the bodies of the citizens who were killed and sacrificed to the Beast Rune. The hole was messily filled in with dirt, and flowers could be spotted around the edges of the circle as if people had been mourning the dead. Elsa heard the sound of a child's footsteps running through a back street, and she started imagining that the sound was a hand pointing a gun at her. Elsa then started thinking of how the Howling Vice Guild turned death from an act of mourning to one of despising. The Howling Vice Guild was a world of selection, betrayal, and calculation, and its members weren't even considered compatriots. After more than a decade of apprentices and squires unable to gain promotion within the guild, 3 people ascended to the rank of knight under the tutelage of Sorrow, which created friction and imbalance within the guild. Just a little note, Sorrow is also the same guy who trained Nash. Elsa made her way up Joustin Hill, and as she took the final step on the stairs, she spotted a man with long dark hair standing by a stone pillar. Victor looked at her and said, "Tall blonde woman, huh?" as he scratched his chin. He continued by telling her that he had heard a lot of things about her that he thought were just rumours, and he didn't believe them until now. Elsa became alarmed, not because of his muscular body or because of his sword that she recognised as a weapon of fine workmanship, but because he had an amused look in his eyes and he was carefully measuring Elsa's movements. Elsa recognised the real power hidden within him. Victor set Elsa's mind at ease by telling her that he doesn't make a habit of sticking his beak in the revenge of others and that she has nothing to fear from him. The Celestial Sword chimed in by telling Victor that he'd get in a lot less trouble if he took care of himself and didn't act unnecessarily. Victor responded by telling the Celestial Sword that the most troublesome thing in his life is you, and who else would bother parading around an old blade whispering on their back. The Celestial Sword started to lose its temper at Victor's comments about it being old and asked him to repeat himself. Victor responded by telling the Celestial Sword that it's been alive for over 800 years and it still hasn't lived. He then asked the sword if there's no end to its arrogance. Elsa looked on in confusion but noticed that her guns had started to pulsate, something that only happens when they sense the presence of another gun. A familiar voice called out Victor's name. Elsa turned and spotted Ryu walking towards him. Ryu started telling Victor that Flick is angry but cut himself off mid-sentence when he spotted Elsa. Clive appeared behind Ryu, putting his hand on Ryu's shoulder and moving him aside while glaring at Elsa in surprise. In a low voice, Clive asked Elsa to tell him why. Elsa asked him what he's talking about. Clive responded by asking why she, a Knight-class gunner, missed a vital point and didn't kill him. Elsa couldn't help but wryly smile as she asked Clive if that's really what he wants to know. She wondered how a man could so easily and ruthlessly take the life of another, especially one who was so close. She reminded Clive that they were once friends and asked him if he'd miss her. Clive cut her off and demanded to know why she had killed Kelly, as Kelly was like an older brother to them. As children, Clive often attempted to act grown-up towards Elsa, despite the two being almost the same age. Elsa would often tease him for it, calling him just a boy. Growing up in the Howling Vice Guild, surrounded by death and deception, Clive, Elsa and Kelly always looked out for each other and protected one another, which wasn't the norm within the guild. Children growing up in the tower were taught about deception, assassination techniques, as well as to never forgive others. The Howling Vice Guild were surrounded by powerless people who pandered to them due to dependency. Hatred and distrust of others was common within the guild, and many had a thirst for power. Clive, however, despite being raised to deceive by the guild, never lied, and he failed to see how Kelly suffered or how Elsa was neglected. Elsa finally spoke, telling Clive what a pitiful end such a kind man like Kelly ended up having. Clive, almost screaming in anger, told Elsa not to say that about Kelly and demanded to know why she didn't kill him, taunting her to shoot him like she shot Kelly. For Clive, the Howling Vice Guild was his world, the only world he had ever known, and Elsa destroyed his world when she killed Kelly and ran away. He told Elsa that the guild and his brother were the only things keeping him connected to the world, that she's already robbed him of his brother and he won't allow her to erase the one piece of his world that remains. Clive pointed Storm at Elsa and Elsa asked him to stop it, telling him that there's no reason to serve the guild as much as he does. Clive asked her if she's trying to fool him again, and Elsa replied that she's never lied to him or ridiculed him, though she certainly teased him, as she called him a boy just like she did as they were growing up. Clive responded that she fooled him that night. The story then cuts to a flashback of Clive and Elsa in the tower on that night. It was the night before a duel. Clive advised Elsa not to go as there was no need for her and Kelly to duel each other. He asked her what's wrong, and Elsa repeatedly reassured Clive that nothing was wrong, but she was lying. Elsa had her hand on Storm's trigger and Clive quietly told her to pray. Elsa laughed as praying wasn't something that children at the tower done. Only the gunners with their guns in their hands could decide everything. Life and death was decided by their own arms. The story then cuts back to the present as the Celestial Sword called them all idiots and asked where the guards are. A few guards finally appeared and all aimed their arrows at Elsa. Elsa scanned the area looking for an escape, but the only way out was from the staircase leading down into the city. She knew she couldn't escape down the stairs into the city, and without any hesitation, Elsa ran towards the back of the conference hall on the opposite side of the hill from the guards. The grassland below the hill was overgrown with dense bushes and thickets of trees, and Elsa knew her only chance to escape was to jump. Ryu tried chasing after her, but Flick jumped out of the conference hall and grabbed him while calling out his name. It wasn't the first time Elsa had heard the name Ryu. His name had been spoken about by the people of the city-states with awe and hope. He united the people of the city-states against the overwhelming odds of the Highland Kingdom like a pipe dream come true. Elsa was surprised by how young he was and wondered how so many people were attracted to his eyes. She was amazed that even Clive put his faith in him. Clive cried out for her to stop. Elsa responded that there's a small village west of Highland's royal capital, Renwi, and that she'll meet him there. Clive shouted out that he can't let her go. He pointed his gun at her and squeezed the trigger, but once again Storm refused to fire, just as it did in Radit. Elsa then leapt off Joustin Hill, sliding down the slope, scratching and tearing herself along the branches of trees as she disappeared into the overgrown grassland. Clive looked down at Storm, repeatedly asking it why it didn't fire as Chapter 3 comes to an end. Chapter 4 opens with the Highland army approaching Mews. 30 Highland soldiers were making their way up the steps to Joustin Hill, where only 7 members of the New Alliance army were: Ryu, Clive, Victor, Flick and 3 guards. Clive shouted at them all to get out of here, and Victor told him not so loud in his ears. Victor then pulled Clive back and looked over at Flick. Flick nodded and gripped the handle of his sword. The lightning rune on his hand started to flash and thunder roared from the sky above. Lightning struck and exploded in the center of the Highland soldiers, and Flick raised his arms to protect his eyes from the flash. Clive saw only shadows being blown away from the lightning strike. While the electricity hadn't yet subsided, Flick charged into the Highland soldiers, who were now in a state of disarray. The Highland archers began tracking Flick's movements as the bright colour of his outfit made him an easy target despite them being partially blinded by the flash of his lightning. Flick was moving as flashy and swiftly as possible to divert their attention away from Ryu. Clive took a step back and leaned his injured shoulder against the stone pillar in the centre of the hill to stabilise his posture. The pain dulled the sensation in his fingers, but Clive reminded himself that it's impossible for a Night-class gunner to miss his target. Clive could hear the sound of a Highland soldier loosing an arrow, and Ryu, without looking, swung his tonfa sideways and deflected the arrow. The sound of swords clashing and clinking together could be heard as Victor engaged the Highland soldiers. Clive aimed his gun at the Highland soldiers and squeezed the trigger. Some of the Highland soldiers who were approaching Flick were thrown backwards towards the stairs from Clive's gunfire. As Flick and Clive were picking off the Highland soldiers, Victor was fighting side by side with Ryu. Ryu swung his tonfa sideways to deflect one of the soldiers' attacks, but lost his footing and stumbled to the ground. With one hand on the ground, Ryu struggled to regain his footing and drove his tonfa into the soldier's shin. A second soldier approached Ryu with his sword overhead, and Clive shot him between the eyes. As Clive aimed at his next target, he spotted the first soldier he had shot, who was still alive and moving on the ground. The man was barely alive and bleeding profusely from his throat. The man looked up at Clive but couldn't muster any words. Clive aimed his gun at the soldier and squeezed the trigger to end his suffering. Flick then called out asking where Ryu was. Clive turned around thinking that Ryu had been injured. They saw that the door to the conference hall had been opened to use as a makeshift shield, and Ryu could be spotted on his knees by the door. Victor rushed over and saw Ryu holding the hand of one of their own guards who was laying on the ground with a bent arrow piercing through his body. Victor pulled the arrow from the man's body. The fighting now over, Clive made his way to where Elsa leapt from the hill while dragging his leg. He looked over the railing, but all he could see were thickets of trees. He remembered Elsa's words about meeting him in a small village to the west of Highland's capital and wondered if she was being truthful or trying to torment him. Clive began questioning Elsa's words about her telling him that there's no reason to serve the guild. As Clive gripped Storm, a bright light began to glow from behind him. The agonizing pain Clive had been in from the injuries to his shoulder and leg began to fade. He turned around and saw Ryu using the power of the bright shield rune to heal the injured guard. The power of the rune made Clive feel uneasy. Flick cleaned his blade with a water bottle and splashed his hair before throwing the bottle to Victor, who washed away the blood from his arm. During the battle, the bullet wound on Clive's shoulder had reopened thanks to the strain Clive had put himself under. He tore the bandage from his bullet wound off his shoulder and noticed that the wound had begun closing up at a rapid pace thanks to the power of Ryu's rune. Victor looked at him and asked him if he's planning on leaving in search of Elsa. Clive responded by telling Victor that it has nothing to do with him. Ryu interrupted by calling out Clive's name and telling him that he has no right to stop him, but it would be best to wait until they break through the ranks of the Highland army. It took Clive a moment to notice that Ryu was looking down at all of the dead Highland soldiers as he spoke. He then understood why Ryu said what he did. It'd be too dangerous to go after Elsa until Highland was defeated. Clive started thinking to himself how painful it must be for Ryu to have to take the lives of so many with his life-healing hands, as the guard whose life Ryu saved lay groaning on the ground. The rune's power made Clive feel uneasy, as to him some wounds don't have to heal. The pain of being shot, the pain of losing Kelly, to Clive, pain was sustenance and he didn't need to be healed as his only goal was revenge. Clive reassured Ryu that he'll fulfill his promise and help him win the war. With those words spoken, Clive began to walk down the steps of Joustin Hill. He needed to temporarily distance himself from Ryu and his companions as he felt his anger towards Elsa waver. He feared that if his anger continued to waver, if he questioned the Howling Vice Guild, he'd stop himself in his tracks and he'd never again know the feel of the guild's garden in his hands. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 opens with Elsa arriving at Saja village. A village so remote that its name was barely known. The only reason anyone would ever travel here was due to the rune masters who handled rare runes. Elsa enjoyed the peaceful scenery of the villagers going about their lives, and memories of her childhood came rushing back to her. Memories of the days she spent with her parents, even though she could no longer remember their faces or their voices. She couldn't even remember what happened, but still, this view was Elsa's sanctuary. All those days she spent in the guild, she would think back fondly of her time in Saja village. Elsa believed this was the difference between her and Clive. She knew life outside the guild, but Clive was born and raised in it. He had no other world. The guild was everything to him, the only world he had ever known, and he blindly trusted in it. Elsa turned a corner to enter an alley and spoke to two women for a short while. The alley looked exactly as she remembered, and she began to reminisce about her childhood. In the spring, yellow flowers bloomed along the road of the village, and she always tried to finish her mother's requests as soon as possible. An item store existed 2 houses away, which was run by an old retired rune master who often complimented Elsa's hair as if it were sunlight. A large oak tree that once cast a cool shadow over the alley broke off its roots and fell over on a summer night. Behind this tree had been the house where Elsa was born, but now the house was gone. All that remained was a small half-buried crumbling hut in the corner of where the house once stood. The hut was tilted as if it was ready to collapse at any moment. Elsa opened the door and walked inside. The hut was crammed with old junk, and no matter what she touched, no memories came back to her. She couldn't remember her parents' faces, their voices, the touch of their hands or the warmth of their hugs. The memories which were so vivid while she was in the Howling Vice Guild were now so far away. The women she had spoken to in the alley earlier had told her that the people who used to live there disappeared a long time ago and nobody in the village remembers them. Elsa left the hut and spotted a young girl looking up at her curiously. The girl looked to be around the same age as Elsa was when her parents sold her to the Howling Vice Guild. The girl had the same platinum blonde hair as Elsa did, and it was braided in the same way that Elsa's mother used to braid her hair. The girl smiled at Elsa as her mother rushed over and hurried her back inside the house. Elsa began thinking about the days she spent with Kelly and Clive in the Howling Vice Guild. She always felt like a stranger and thought about how different she was from those who were born in the guild, which always gave her a sense that she didn't belong. Saja village was exactly as she remembered, but she was now nothing more than a stranger here too. Elsa once again began thinking back on the Howling Vice Guild. The elders within the guild had wanted to promote Kelly to the rank of master without Storm's approval, and even though Kelly knew they were manipulating him, he still obeyed their orders and challenged Elsa to a duel. All Elsa had learned after being taken from Saja village was the art of killing. Since that day, instead of embracing people, all she has ever done is hurt people, forced to take the lives of both sinful and innocent alike, including those she loved. She then remembered Kelly's last words to her, that he loved her and Clive. Elsa thought what a gentle fool he was. Stern and Mond then began to pulsate, warning Elsa that Clive was near as Chapter 5 comes to an end. Chapter 6 opens with Clive thinking of his dreams of Kelly's death. He never witnessed Kelly's death, but he dreamt of it over and over again. In his dreams, Elsa was smiling, a faint smile as she held her hand out to Clive. Elsa used to always tease Clive for being so emotional, and she treated him gently compared to how she treated everyone else. Clive remembered the touch of her hand, the fingers of the woman who loved him that showed him compassion, showed merciless death to others. Clive recalled repeating the words "don't go" over and over to Elsa. By the time he was informed of the outcome of Kelly and Elsa's duel, Kelly was dead and Elsa had fled with Stern and Mond. Clive was filled with anger and he didn't know who to direct his anger at. Was he to direct his anger at Kelly, who told him nothing of the duel, or was he to direct his anger at Elsa for leaving him? The duel between the two people he loved the most had destroyed everything that Clive believed in. Clive snapped out of his thoughts when he heard Victor making a joke at him. As they approached Saja village, Storm began pulsating, signalling that Elsa was near. Seeing Elsa in the distance made Clive remember how Elsa embraced him in silence the night before her duel with Kelly. Elsa spoke, commenting that since they're here, that must mean that the Highland Kingdom is on the brink of collapse. Ryu got off his horse, and slowly Elsa took out Stern and Mond. She placed the guns in Ryu's hands and told him that it's an honour to have him serve as a witness. She then requested a duel with Clive. She asked Clive to pick which gun he wants, Stern, which represents trust in the guild, or Mond, which represents betrayal. Without any hesitation, Clive picked up Stern, and Elsa commented that she knew that's what he'd choose. Clive inspected the gun to make sure it was loaded with bullets. Clive told her "any time you're ready," and then asked her if she wants to take some time to regret her life and the remnants of the world she left behind a little longer. Elsa responded that there's no need for that and that she's ready. The two walked back a distance and Elsa chanted, "Howling Vice, shadow descending on the ground," to which Clive responded, "Howling Vice, radiance that shoots a god." And in unison they both said, "We, the cursed vice that separates life and death. In this land, at this time, the children of the tower are wanting each other's blood to flow, seeking each other's souls. Listen, cursed children, we are the final sound that heralds battle." And at that moment, rather than hearing the sound of Mond firing, Clive heard Elsa call out his name as she told him he won. Clive knelt down beside Elsa, blood gushing from the wound in her chest. Clive inspected Mond and noticed there were no bullets inside. Elsa spoke to him, asking him if he really believed she could kill him, before teasingly calling him a boy. Elsa faintly laughed and told Clive that she should have died the day she shot Kelly. Clive held her hand as she told him that this was the village where she was born, that she no longer has any parents and no one remembers who they are, but still, this is where her heart wanted to return to. Elsa then called Clive a poor boy, pitying him and Kelly for being born and raised in the guild and not knowing life outside of it. She told Clive that Storm had chosen her to be its next wielder, but the guild's elders chose Kelly as they figured he was the easiest to manipulate. Clive knew that Elsa was speaking the truth as Storm refused to fire at her on multiple occasions. Elza then told him that the guild can't go against the will of Storm, but the elders twisted the facts and orchestrated a duel between her and Kelly to get what they wanted. She then told him that Stern and Mond were the guns that were prepared for the duel, and that the only gun loaded with bullets was Stern. Clive responded by telling her that he doesn't believe the guild would do such a thing, but Elza replied that Kelly knew Mond wasn't loaded. Elza began convulsing, and Clive looked back at Ryu as if he was about to ask her to use the power of the Bright Shield rune to save her. As if reading his mind, Elza dug her nails into the back of Clive's hand. The unexpected force snapped Clive's attention back to her. Elza told Clive that if the guild he believes in is always right, why is he so frightened? She then added that Kelly agreed to the Elder's wishes because he wanted power, but he became burdened by his choice, and just like Kelly, she too wanted power in order to protect herself and Clive. Clive told her to stop talking, and Elza responded by saying that she regrets shooting Kelly and escaping from the guild alive. Clive called out Elza's name, and Elza thanked him because now her soul is free. Clive whispered her name as he realised this would be the last time he felt the warmth of her hand, the same hand that he had held so many times before. Elza started laughing, and with her hoarse breath she teasingly called Clive a naive boy for believing such a story. Clive responded, "What?" thinking that she'd been messing with him the entire time, but Elza was only teasing him one last time. Elza then told him to return to the guild, that it's been an honour, but he can't catch her anymore. The silence that followed came frighteningly quick for Clive. With one hand he brushed his fingers through her hair, his other hand still holding her hand. Clive's mission was now over. Still kneeling over her body, Clive wondered if she'd want her body buried here, in the village she called home. He wondered if he should stay here for a while, and he wondered if he'd ever forgive Elza. And that's it for Clive and Elza's story. As I mentioned at the beginning, the information in this video came from a short story titled Return Cursed Guns from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 4 that released in Japan in June 2002. This short story is where much of the information we know about the Howling Vice Guild comes from. There are some other little bits of information we have about the guild thanks to Nash and Zaja's story from Suikoden. At some point I will make a video compiling all of the information we have on the Howling Vice Guild and its members, as I know they're very popular among the Suikoden community. So with this video finished, we only have 8 more character short stories to cover from the books. You can find a list of which characters receive short stories in the pinned comment. Let me know who you want to see next, or if you have any ideas for any other topics you want me to cover, do let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.